What if I told you that hidden in the mountains of Africa existed a Christian empire so bizarre, so utterly alien to everything we know about medieval Christianity, that its own priests practiced cannibalism as a holy sacrament? What if the most devout Christian nation on earth was simultaneously the most terrifying? For over 1,000 years, while Europe fought its crusades and built its cathedrals, a different kind of Christianity thrived in the highlands of Ethiopia. This was not the gentle faith of turning the other cheek. This was Christianity as you've never imagined it, where emperors claimed to be direct descendants of King Solomon, where monks levitated during prayer, where human flesh was consumed in the name of Christ, and where the line between divine miracle and horrific ritual blurred beyond recognition. The priests of this empire didn't just serve God, they claimed to become Him. The emperors didn't just rule by divine right, they insisted they were literally divine. And the faithful didn't just believe in miracles. They witnessed acts so shocking that European visitors fled in terror, calling it the work of demons disguised as angels. Tonight, we're going to peel back the veil on the most isolated Christian civilization in history, where faith became fanaticism, where devotion turned deadly, and where the pursuit of spiritual purity led to practices that would make medieval inquisitors weep with horror. But before we descend into this rabbit hole of religious extremism and imperial madness, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, what's the most shocking thing you've ever learned about a religion you thought you knew? Because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you believed about Christianity itself. From the outside, medieval Ethiopia appeared to be Christianity's greatest success story in Africa. While Islamic armies swept across North Africa and Christian Byzantium crumbled under Ottoman pressure, the Ethiopian empire stood as an impregnable fortress of faith, unconquered and uncompromising. The kingdom traced its origins to the legendary Queen of Sheba, who supposedly traveled to Jerusalem to test the wisdom of King Solomon. According to Ethiopian tradition, their union produced Menelik V, the founder of the Solomonic dynasty that would rule Ethiopia for over 2 millennia. This wasn't just royal propaganda, it was the fundamental cornerstone of Ethiopian identity. The emperors, known as the Negusa Nagast, or King of Kings, didn't simply rule Ethiopia, they embodied it. Each emperor was considered a direct descendant of Solomon himself, making them not just political leaders, but living links to biblical history. They wore the title Lion of Judah and claimed dominion not just over their subjects, but over all Christian souls in Africa. Ethiopian Christianity had developed in complete isolation from Rome and Constantinople. Cut off by Islamic expansion in the 7th century, the Ethiopian Church evolved its own unique traditions, its own interpretations of Scripture, and its own understanding of what it meant to be Christian. They possessed books of the Bible that had been lost elsewhere, maintained practices that predated the Council of Nicaea, and developed theological concepts that would have been considered heretical anywhere else in the Christian world. The church was everywhere and everything. Monks didn't retreat from worldly affairs, they shaped them. Priests didn't simply conduct services, they governed provinces. The emperor wasn't crowned by religious authority, he was religious authority, serving simultaneously as head of state and head of church, temporal ruler, and spiritual guide. This seemed like the perfect Christian kingdom, a nation where faith and power moved in perfect harmony, where biblical tradition lived on unbroken, where Christianity had found its purest expression. European explorers who first heard tales of this kingdom called it the realm of Prester John, a mythical Christian emperor ruling somewhere in the east. But they had no idea what Christianity looked like when it grew in complete isolation, when it evolved without external oversight, when faith became fused with practices that predated Christ by millennia. The first European to witness Ethiopian religious practices firsthand was Portuguese priest Francisco Alvares in the early 16th century. What he documented would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ethiopian monks didn't just fast during Lent, they practiced extreme mortification that bordered on self-torture. Some would bury themselves alive for days, emerging skeletal and hallucinating, claiming to have conversed with angels. Others would stand motionless for months, their feet growing roots into the ground, their bodies becoming living crucifixes. But it was the communion practices that shattered Alvarez's understanding of Christianity entirely. In certain monastic communities, the bread and wine of communion weren't symbolic. They were replaced with actual human flesh and blood. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally. Fresh human meat was consecrated and consumed as the body of Christ. The justification was theologically sophisticated and absolutely terrifying. These monks argued that if Christ truly gave his flesh for salvation, then consuming actual human flesh brought them closer to divine truth. They sourced this flesh from executed criminals, from stillborn infants, from the bodies of saints who had died in ecstasy. The holier the source, the more powerful the communion. Ethiopian religious texts, written in Ge'ez, describe rituals that would make medieval Europeans flee in horror. Monks would engage in divine possession, allowing what they claimed were angels to inhabit their bodies. During these possessions, they would speak in tongues, prophesy the future, and perform acts of apparent levitation. But the possessed monks would also attack non-believers, tear flesh with their bare hands, and drink human blood while claiming to be vessels of divine love. The emperor himself participated in rituals that blended Christianity with practices far older and darker. During certain religious festivals, he would consume the raw flesh of lions, claiming that this gave him the spiritual strength of the Lion of Judah. The flesh wasn't cooked, wasn't blessed. It was torn from living animals and eaten while still warm, blood streaming down the emperor's face as he proclaimed his divine nature. Women in Ethiopian religious communities faced horrors that European nuns couldn't imagine. Female monastics were often buried alive during religious festivals, then exhumed after 3 days to see if they had experienced divine visions. Those who survived with their sanity intact were declared saints. Those who emerged mad or dead were considered martyrs. Either way, they were consumed by the community in ritualistic cannibalism, their flesh distributed as Holy Communion. But perhaps most disturbing was the practice of sacred marriage between monks and young girls, some as young as 9 years old. These weren't marriages in any conventional sense. They were ritualistic unions designed to create Christ children, offspring who would be born into holiness and raised as living vessels of divine power. The girls rarely survived childbirth, and their bodies were preserved as relics, their bones ground into powder and mixed into communion wine. The most powerful figure in this theocratic nightmare wasn't the emperor. It was Abuna Tekle Haymanot. a monk whose story reads like a fever dream of religious extremism taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. Born in the 13th century, Tekle Haymanot wasn't content with ordinary sainthood. From childhood, he displayed an obsession with suffering that alarmed even his devout parents. He would deliberately seek out pain, claiming that physical agony brought him closer to Christ's passion. By adolescence, he was practicing forms of self-mortification that left permanent damage to his body. But Tekle Haymanot's true innovation was in what he called divine consumption. He convinced his followers that eating human flesh wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary for salvation. He established monasteries where cannibalism was a daily practice, where human meat was served at every meal, where the consumption of fellow humans was considered the highest form of worship. Tekle Haymanot claimed that Christ's commandment to eat my flesh and drink my blood was meant literally, not symbolically. His monasteries became slaughterhouses of the faithful, where volunteers would offer themselves to be consumed alive by their brothers in Christ. These weren't quick deaths. The victims would be slowly dismembered over days, keeping them conscious so they could participate in their own consumption, praising God as their flesh was carved away and eaten. The monk himself practiced what he preached. Contemporary accounts describe him consuming the raw flesh of over 300 people during his lifetime, always while in a state of religious ecstasy, always claiming divine inspiration. He would eat human hearts while they were still beating, drink blood while it was still warm, and consume brains while praising the intellectual gifts of his victims. But Tekle Haymanot's most disturbing achievement was his influence over the imperial court. He convinced Emperor Yakuno Amlak that consuming human flesh would grant him immortality, that drinking human blood would give him prophetic powers, that eating the organs of holy men would make him a living god. The emperor didn't just believe these claims, he institutionalized them. Under Tekle Haymanot's guidance, the Ethiopian court established formal positions for flesh providers, people whose job was to supply fresh human meat for imperial consumption. These weren't criminals or enemies. They were volunteers from among the most devout Christians in the empire, people who considered it the highest honor to be consumed by their god emperor. The monk's influence extended beyond the palace. He established a network of monasteries across Ethiopia where cannibalistic communion was standard practice. These institutions became centers of learning and power, their libraries filled with theological justifications for consuming human flesh, their archives documenting thousands of holy meals where the faithful literally ate each other in the name of divine love. Even more terrifying was Tekle Haymanot's claim of levitation. Multiple witnesses documented him rising several feet off the ground during prayer, floating in mid-air for hours while consuming human flesh. Whether this was genuine levitation, elaborate trickery, or mass hallucination remains unclear, but the impact was undeniable. An entire empire came to believe that their holiest monk could defy gravity through cannibalism. The end came not through external conquest or internal rebellion, but through the ultimate expression of Tekle Haymanot's twisted theology. In 1283, at the height of his power and influence, he announced that God had commanded him to demonstrate the ultimate act of faith, self-consumption. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing religious ceremony in recorded history. Tekle Haymanot had his followers slowly dismember him while he remained conscious. eating pieces of his own flesh as they were cut away, praising God with each bite of his own body. The process took 3 days, during which the monk allegedly remained in constant prayer, consuming himself as a living communion until only his head and torso remained. But even death couldn't end the horror he had unleashed. His followers completed the consumption of his corpse, eating every scrap of flesh, drinking every drop of blood, grinding his bones into powder that was mixed into communion wine for decades afterward. His monasteries continued practicing cannibalistic communion long after his death, claiming that consuming human flesh allowed them to channel his spirit. The imperial court, convinced by Tekle Haymanot's teachings that cannibalism was the path to divinity, institutionalized the practice throughout the empire. Royal feasts featured human flesh as the centerpiece, served on golden plates and consumed with religious ceremony. The emperor's bodyguards were fed exclusively on human meat, believed to make them supernaturally strong and loyal. Ethiopian religious festivals became elaborate displays of sanctified cannibalism. During major Christian holidays, volunteers would offer themselves for consumption, their flesh distributed to the faithful as blessed communion. Children were taught that eating human meat was a holy act, that consuming their elders was a form of respect, that cannibalism was the highest expression of Christian love. The practice spread beyond the monasteries and the court into the general population. Ethiopian families began consuming their own dead as a form of funeral rite, believing that eating departed relatives kept their spirits alive within the family. Villages established communal meals where human flesh was shared among neighbors as a symbol of Christian unity. European missionaries who arrived in the 16th century found an empire where cannibalism had become so normalized that Ethiopian Christians couldn't understand why Europeans were horrified. To the Ethiopians, Europeans who refused to eat human flesh weren't more moral. They were spiritually deficient, too weak to embrace the full implications of Christ's sacrifice. The theological justifications became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. Ethiopian religious scholars wrote treatises explaining which parts of the human body were most holy to consume, which methods of preparation were most pleasing to God, which prayers should be recited while eating human flesh. They developed a complex hierarchy of cannibalistic communion, where eating saints provided more spiritual benefit than eating sinners, where consuming children was holier than consuming adults, where eating the living was more sacred than eating the dead. But the ultimate horror was yet to come, when the empire's cannibalistic Christianity collided with external forces that would test whether their faith could survive contact with the outside world and whether the outside world could survive contact with them. The collision came in 1520 when Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached the Ethiopian coast, seeking the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John. What his men discovered instead was a nightmare that challenged everything they thought they knew about Christianity, humanity, and the nature of religious faith itself. The Portuguese were initially welcomed as fellow Christians, brothers in faith who had finally reached the isolated Ethiopian highlands. Emperor Lebna Dengel received them with great ceremony, eager to establish diplomatic and religious ties with European Christianity. But the welcome quickly turned to horror as the visitors witnessed Ethiopian religious practices firsthand. During their first Ethiopian Christmas, the Portuguese were invited to witness what their hosts called the Great Communion, a festival where the entire imperial court consumed human flesh in celebration of Christ's birth. Dozens of volunteers had offered themselves for slaughter, their bodies prepared with elaborate ritual and served as the centerpiece of the Christmas feast. The Portuguese watched in stunned horror as Ethiopian nobles, many of them learned theologians who spoke fluent Latin and could quote Augustine and Aquinas, casually consumed human hearts while discussing the finer points of Christian doctrine. Children as young as 5 were given pieces of human flesh to eat, their parents explaining that this would ensure their salvation and strengthen their faith. When the Portuguese expressed revulsion, their Ethiopian hosts were genuinely confused. How could fellow Christians reject the literal body of Christ? How could they claim to follow Jesus while refusing to truly consume his flesh? To the Ethiopians, the Portuguese weren't more civilized. They were spiritually incomplete, practicing a watered-down version of Christianity that missed its essential truth. The theological debates that followed were surreal and terrifying. Ethiopian priests, many of them brilliant scholars with extensive libraries and sophisticated understanding of Christian history, presented detailed arguments for cannibalistic communion. They produced ancient texts, claimed apostolic authority, and demonstrated a depth of biblical knowledge that impressed even as it horrified their European visitors. But theory became practice when Emperor Lebna Dengel invited the Portuguese to participate in the consumption of a captured enemy general. The emperor explained that eating their foe would demonstrate their unity as Christians, that sharing his flesh would bind their nations together in sacred brotherhood. When the Portuguese refused, they were seen not as moral, but as weak, not as civilized, but as spiritually impoverished. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Portuguese missionary Francisco Alvarez attempted to conduct a European-style mass using bread and wine instead of human flesh and blood. Ethiopian worshippers rioted, claiming that the foreign priest was offering them fake communion, that he was insulting Christ by refusing to provide real flesh and real blood. Several Portuguese soldiers were killed in the religious violence that followed. The final break came when Alvarez discovered the fate of earlier European visitors to Ethiopia. Portuguese explorers who had arrived decades earlier hadn't died of disease or been killed in battle. They had been consumed in religious ceremonies, their flesh distributed among Ethiopian monasteries as blessed communion, their bones ground into powder for religious rituals. The Ethiopian court had preserved detailed records of these consumptions, treating them not as murders, but as holy events. The Europeans had been honored guests at their own consumption, fed elaborate final meals, before being slowly dismembered and eaten by their hosts. Ethiopian chroniclers recorded their final words, their prayers, their apparent acceptance of being consumed for the greater glory of God. When the Portuguese demanded an explanation, Emperor Lebna Dengel was genuinely surprised by their anger. The earlier Europeans had been given the highest honor possible in Ethiopian Christianity. They had become living communion, their flesh strengthening the faith of thousands of believers. Their consumption had been an act of love, not violence, a demonstration of how deeply Ethiopia valued their European Christian brothers. The revelation that their predecessors had been eaten by their supposed Christian allies shattered Portuguese trust completely. But leaving Ethiopia proved almost impossible. The empire's isolation worked both ways, and the mountain passes were controlled by Ethiopian forces who saw the Portuguese departure as religious betrayal. The escape attempts that followed revealed just how thoroughly cannibalism had integrated into Ethiopian society. Portuguese soldiers captured during skirmishes weren't executed. They were prepared for consumption with elaborate ceremony, their captors genuinely believing that eating European Christians would provide spiritual insights into European military tactics and European faith. The horror reached its peak when Ethiopian forces began using cannibalism as a weapon of war, consuming captured enemies alive to demoralize Portuguese troops. Ethiopian warriors would eat Portuguese hearts while their victims watched, claiming that this transferred European knowledge and courage to Ethiopian bodies. They would drink Portuguese blood during battle, believing it gave them European tactical insights. The psychological impact on the surviving Portuguese was devastating. They found themselves facing an enemy that didn't just want to kill them, but to consume them, not out of hatred, but out of religious devotion. Ethiopian forces would pray over Portuguese captives before eating them, blessing their flesh and thanking God for providing European communion. The few Portuguese who eventually escaped Ethiopia in 1526 carried with them tales so horrific that the Portuguese court initially refused to believe them. The idea that fellow Christians could practice institutionalized cannibalism, that they could consume human flesh as a religious sacrament, challenged fundamental assumptions about Christianity, civilization, and human nature itself. The shadow of Ethiopian cannibalistic Christianity lingered long after the Portuguese escape, influencing European attitudes toward African Christianity for centuries. But more disturbing was the realization that Ethiopia's practices weren't aberrations or corruptions of Christianity. They were logical extensions of Christian theology taken to its absolute extreme. The Ethiopian Empire continued practicing cannibalistic Christianity for centuries after the Portuguese contact, but the outside world had learned its terrible secret. The isolation that had allowed such practices to develop now became a prison, as other Christian nations refused diplomatic contact with a cannibal empire that claimed to represent the true faith. European colonization of Africa deliberately avoided Ethiopian highlands, not because they were impregnable militarily, but because colonial administrators feared that extended contact with cannibalistic Christians might corrupt European settlers. The British Empire, which conquered much of East Africa, maintained a buffer zone around Ethiopia, treating it as a contaminated region that posed spiritual rather than military threats. Even within Ethiopia, the traditional practices began to break down under external pressure and internal questioning. Younger generations of Ethiopian Christians, exposed to European ideas through trade and limited missionary contact, began questioning whether consuming human flesh was truly necessary for salvation. Monastic communities split between traditionalists who maintained cannibalistic practices and reformers who sought alignment with broader Christian norms. The theological debates that raged within Ethiopian Christianity in the 18th and 19th centuries were as complex as they were disturbing. Progressive Ethiopian theologians argued that Christ's commandments about eating his flesh were metaphorical, that cannibalistic communion was a misunderstanding of divine truth. Conservative theologians countered that abandoning human consumption would weaken Ethiopian Christianity, that their ancestors' practices had kept their faith pure while European Christianity had become corrupt and weak. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the scale of what was being abandoned. Ethiopian monasteries contained vast ossuaries filled with human bones, many showing clear evidence of butchering and consumption. Religious sites yielded caches of communion vessels designed specifically for serving human flesh, ornate chalices crafted for drinking human blood, and liturgical texts detailing the proper preparation and blessing of human meat. The modernization of Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik II in the late 19th century marked the official end of cannibalistic Christianity, though practice continued in remote monasteries well into the 20th century. Menelik's government, seeking international recognition and trade relationships, quietly suppressed traditional religious practices while maintaining the fiction that Ethiopian Christianity had always been conventional. But the transformation was incomplete and traumatic. Generations of Ethiopians had been raised to believe that consuming human flesh was not just acceptable but necessary for salvation. The sudden prohibition of these practices created a crisis of faith that rippled through Ethiopian society, leaving many believers confused about what authentic Christianity actually required. The last documented case of ritual cannibalism in Ethiopian Christianity occurred in 1935, when Italian forces invading Ethiopia discovered a remote monastery where monks were still practicing traditional communion using human flesh. The Italian military, themselves no strangers to violence, were so horrified by what they found that they abandoned their planned advance and requested immediate evacuation from the region. Even today, the legacy of Ethiopia's cannibalistic Christian past haunts the nation's religious landscape. Ethiopian Orthodox priests occasionally discover hidden caches of human bones in ancient churches, remains of saints and martyrs who were consumed by earlier generations of believers. These discoveries are quietly reburied without publicity, but they serve as reminders of a faith that once demanded the ultimate sacrifice, not just spiritual devotion, but literal consumption of fellow believers. What makes the Ethiopian case so disturbing isn't just the cannibalism itself, but how thoroughly it was integrated into recognizable Christian theology and practice. These weren't primitive savages or demonic cultists. They were sophisticated theologians who built magnificent churches, preserved ancient biblical texts, and maintained complex theological traditions while simultaneously practicing ritualistic cannibalism as the highest form of Christian devotion. The Ethiopian Empire's cannibalistic Christianity reveals uncomfortable truths about the malleability of religious faith, about how isolated communities can develop practices that seem obviously wrong to outsiders but feel absolutely right to participants. It demonstrates how religious devotion, taken to extremes without external moderation, can justify virtually any practice in the name of divine truth. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that Ethiopian Christians weren't rebelling against their faith. They were trying to practice it as perfectly as possible. Their cannibalism wasn't a rejection of Christ's teachings, but an attempt to follow those teachings literally and completely. They consumed human flesh, not because they were evil, but because they believed it was the most sacred act possible. The archives are still largely sealed, and Ethiopian Orthodox authorities continue to discourage detailed historical research into traditional practices. Rumors persist that some remote monasteries maintain elements of traditional communion, that ancient texts describing cannibalistic rituals remain hidden in church libraries, that the full extent of Ethiopian Christian cannibalism has never been fully documented. What we know for certain is that for over 1,000 years, an entire Christian empire practiced ritualistic cannibalism as a central element of their faith, that they consumed human flesh, not out of savagery, but out of devotion, and that they genuinely believed this made them better Christians than the rest of the world. The story of Ethiopian Christianity serves as a dark mirror to all religious faith, reflecting how devotion can become fanaticism, how theological logic can justify horrific practices, and how isolation can transform the most benevolent teachings into something unrecognizable and terrifying. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of faith itself, questions that have no easy answers, and implications that reach far beyond the Ethiopian highlands. So the next time someone claims that religion is inherently civilizing, remember the Ethiopian Empire, where the most devout Christians in Africa spent centuries consuming each other in the name of divine love. Remember that faith without external check, devotion without external restraint, can create horrors that challenge our most basic assumptions about morality, humanity, and the nature of belief itself. Hit subscribe if this glimpse into history's darkest religious corners has left you questioning everything you thought you knew about faith and civilization. And tell me in the comments, what other historical religious practices do you think might shock us if we knew the full truth? Because as the Ethiopian story proves, the most disturbing revelations often come from the places we